The Etruscans are one of the most studied and least understood peoples in the history of ancient Europe. They built their cities across what is now Tuscany. They invented a form of government the Romans would later borrow, taught the Mediterranean world new techniques in metalwork, and spoke a language so unusual that scholars are still only partly able to read it, 26 centuries after it fell silent. They were, by almost any measure, foundational to what Western civilization became. And yet, for all of that, for all the painted tombs and bronze figures and borrowed political structures, the question of where they came from had gone unanswered since the 5th century before the Common Era, when the first written argument about it appeared. Generations of historians, archaeologists, and linguists built careers on competing interpretations of the same thin evidence. Then, in September of 2021, a team of researchers published a paper that closed the argument, not by finding a better reading of that old evidence, but by producing evidence no ancient historian had any way to imagine. What the science found does not simplify the Etruscans. It makes them stranger, not simpler, and it leaves behind a new puzzle that the DNA itself cannot resolve. To understand why the 2021 paper mattered, you have to understand how old the argument was. It began with Herodotus. Writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, the Greek historian reported that an 18-year famine had struck the kingdom of Lydia in western Anatolia. The Lydian king divided his people in two. Half stayed. The other half sailed west under the leadership of his son, a prince named Tyrrhenus. They landed in central Italy and took his name. Tyrrhenus became the Tyrrhenians, the Greek word for the people Latin speakers called Etruscans. Eastern Mediterranean migrants, building a great civilization before Rome absorbed and erased them. That story held for better than 2,000 years. The opposing view came from Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a Greek writer working 4 centuries after Herodotus. He argued the Etruscans were simply native to Italy, autochthonous, descended from people who had lived there long before any Lydian ships arrived. His evidence was linguistic and cultural. The Etruscans resembled no Eastern people closely enough to justify the migration claim. Both positions had real support. Neither had proof. For 25 centuries, scholars cycled through the same arguments without a way to force a resolution. The tool that settled the debate did not exist when Herodotus wrote. Whole genome sequencing, reconstructing the full genetic profile of ancient individuals from bone and tooth, had by the early 2000s become precise enough to detect specific population signals and migration events. When researchers applied it to ancient Italian populations, they expected to referee a known dispute. But the early studies were inconsistent. Some mitochondrial DNA work, which traces only the maternal line, seemed to find traces of Eastern ancestry in Etruscan samples. Others found nothing. Mitochondrial analysis uses a narrow genetic window, and small samples from complicated burial sites can produce noise that looks like signal. What the field needed was whole genome data from enough confirmed Etruscan individuals to produce a reliable picture. Here is where the theories begin to fracture. When that data arrived in 2021, it did not split the difference between Herodotus and Dionysius. It did not find a moderate Eastern contribution. The genomic signal from Etruscan individuals showed no meaningful evidence of recent Anatolian-related admixture, not reduced, not ambiguous, not present. Herodotus had described a migration event that appears in the genetic record not at all. Before accepting that verdict, it is worth taking Herodotus's case seriously, because it was never simply invented. The Lydian migration story had real support. There were genuine cultural parallels between Etruscan and Eastern Mediterranean practice, specific religious structures, divinatory systems, and material culture that seemed to resemble Anatolian precedents more than Central Italian ones. The Etruscans were also not an Indo-European people. Their language bears no relationship to Latin, Greek, or any tongue in that family. In the ancient world, the most intuitive explanation for a non-Indo-European people surrounded by Indo-European speakers was that they had come from somewhere else. That somewhere, for Herodotus, was Lydia. The problem is the genetic record does not support it. If a substantial population had sailed from Anatolia and settled in Etruria, their genomes would carry that ancestry. Eastern Mediterranean populations of the Bronze Age had distinct profiles, documented clearly in ancient DNA research. Those profiles do not appear in the Etruscan samples. The cultural parallels turn out to be explainable through Mediterranean trade and exchange. Contact looks like movement in the material record. The genome makes the distinction clearly. The Lydian theory was not the only Eastern explanation. There was a second, built on linguistics. The Etruscan language was not entirely alone. On the Greek island of Lemnos, inscriptions proved to be written in a language closely related to Etruscan. Not Greek, not any known Aegean tongue, but something sharing morphology and grammatical structure with the language of Etruria, thousands of kilometers away. The linguist Helmut Rix formalized this in 1998 by proposing the Tyrcenian language family, a pre-Indo-European grouping that included Etruscan, the Lemnian inscriptions, and a related Alpine tongue called Radic. The implication seemed straightforward. Perhaps the Etruscans had Aegean roots, even if the Lydian story was wrong. Some researchers argued the connection ran the other direction, that Tyrcenian speakers originated in Italy and later reached the Aegean. But either way, the linguistic data pointed toward ancient contact with that world. The genetic evidence did not confirm it. The 2021 study found no meaningful Aegean-related genetic influx in the Etruscan samples. The language was connected to the Aegean. The people were not. That gap, a linguistic link with no corresponding genetic signature, is one of the most genuinely puzzling things the study produced. The study was published in Science Advances on September 24, 2021. Led by Cosimo Posth of the University of Tübingen and an international team, it analyzed genome-wide data from 82 ancient individuals at 12 sites across Etruria and southern Italy, spanning 800 BCE to 1000 CE, nearly 2,000 years of continuous genetic record. The findings were unambiguous. Despite their unique culture and puzzling language, the Etruscans were genetically indistinguishable from their neighbors, including the Latins, who inhabited Rome at the same time. Both groups carried ancestry tracing back to populations from the Pontic-Caspian steppe who had arrived during the Bronze Age, long before either civilization existed. Posth stated in written communication with other researchers that the genomic analyses found an autochthonous origin for the Etruscans. Local people, not Lydian migrants, not Aegean colonists, but people whose ancestors had been in the Italian peninsula since the Bronze Age. That answer, however, raised something the DNA alone could not resolve. If the Etruscans descended from steppe-related populations, the groups credited with spreading Indo-European languages across Europe, why did they speak a language that was not Indo-European at all? Here is where the story turns. The instinct, when a historical account this old and confident gets overturned, is to feel something has been lost. A migration story has a shape, a moment of departure, a moment of arrival, a character standing at the bow of a ship watching a coast he will never see again. There is a human scale to it that a genomic result does not automatically restore. But consider what the genomic result actually reveals. It does not give us fewer Etruscans, it gives us more of them. More time, more depth, more continuity than the migration story ever allowed. If the Etruscans were local, if their ancestors had been in central Italy since the Bronze Age, then the civilization that produced those painted tombs and bronze figures was not the product of a transplant. It grew from that particular soil over thousands of years. Think of it this way. Imagine you are shown a photograph of someone who made something remarkable and told they came from somewhere else. That explains their strangeness, accounts for why what they built looks different from everything around it. Then you learn they were always from here, that their difference wasn't imported, it was just theirs. That isn't a lesser story, it is a considerably deeper one. The finding that the Etruscans were local does not diminish what they were. It clarifies it. A people do not need to have crossed a sea to be remarkable. The Etruscans developed metallurgical techniques the Romans would later claim as their own, established urban centers that shaped one of antiquity's great civilizations, and passed on an alphabet that became, through Rome, the letters being read right now. None of that requires a Lydian ship. And here is where the genomic record adds a final, almost symmetrical layer. The very thing Herodotus was wrong about for the Etruscans, a massive influx of Eastern Mediterranean ancestry into the Italian peninsula, turns out to have happened, just not when he thought and not to the Etruscans. The 2021 study found that during the Roman imperial period, the DNA of Central Italian populations underwent an abrupt shift. Roughly half of the ancestry in imperial-era samples derived from Eastern Mediterranean sources. People relocated across the empire, likely including large numbers of enslaved individuals, who transformed the local gene pool in a way neither the Bronze Age nor the Etruscan era ever had. The East came to Italy. Herodotus just had the wrong civilization. There is one detail from the 2021 study that rarely made its way into summaries. To confirm which individuals were actually Etruscan, rather than later inhabitants buried in Etruscan-era tombs, the team radiocarbon dated every skeleton in their sample. What that process revealed was unexpected. Almost half of the remains found in Etruscan-style tomb structures turned out to be from later periods. Not Etruscans at all, but Roman-era individuals, and later ones still, whose families had found a ready burial space in the old necropolis and used it. The tombs had cycled through new occupants for hundreds of years after the civilization that built them was gone. Their stone rooms stayed open long after they did. The origin question is settled. The question of the language is not. A people carrying steppe ancestry, speaking a non-Indo-European tongue, surrounded by Indo-European neighbors. That paradox belongs now to a different investigation, one that genetics alone cannot resolve. Some questions only become askable once you have answered the ones beneath them. What the DNA gave us was not just a conclusion about where the Etruscans came from. It gave us a cleaner version of a much older question about how a people can be shaped by one history and still speak from another. Every answer in history is also a door.